So we are doing our fall series, and we haven't done a lot of series preaching here at Resurrection. It's kind of something new. The Bible is a series. I mean, you could always say we've always done series preaching because, well, we've preached Scripture, and it is a series in itself. But we're kind of doing a little bit of a targeted series of what that is. And with the Ten Commandments, I was sharing, this is something we teach in confirmation. Right? It's one of the standards, so we teach you as a middle school kid, but we don't ever revisit it as adults. And it's one of those things, how important must it be if we only teach it once and then never look back at it? And in our world right now, where we had 600 plus people in worship this weekend and then people worshiping online, but then you have a much smaller number available for classes, it is during worship that we really are exposing people to who we think God is in this world. And so we're kind of taking this approach of, in our worship time, being able to explore these commandments with the proclamation of law and gospel, what that looks like, but then also to deep dive a little bit into these commandments. Because as we get through them, I think you all may have some questions, right? Especially the thou shalt not kill is always one that people question. What does it mean for war? What does it mean for capital punishment? What does it mean in self-defense? What does it mean with abortion? Right? Like what is thou shalt not kill? And it feels like God does a whole lot of killing in Scripture, as well as orders a lot of people to go about doing a lot of killing in Scripture. And so even that tension of God saying, you don't kill unless I tell you to kill. And what that looks like. So we want to also kind of give some space for some of that dialogue, what that looks like, so we can kind of wrestle with these today. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with you guys? Okay, so again, this class schedule will be following what we're preaching on the Oro Valley campus. Again, both of our campuses are doing this series. Saddlebrook gets it a week earlier. So the preacher who's preaching up at Saddlebrook, that was Pastor Wyatt this past weekend, he will now preach down here the first commandment. So they're just kind of a week earlier, but that way we wanted everyone to hear some of that consistent messaging of what that looks like. It also gives both campuses some good face time with the different pastors. So down here, we don't get Pastor Roger as much. We'll be able to experience that. At Saddlebrook, they'll get the delightful Pastor Tim, myself, and Pastor Wyatt moving up there as well. Why are you laughing at delightful? Yes. He is, I kind of think of Pastor Roger as like, the combination, just hold with me, of Jesus, Yoda, and Buddha. Like, he's just got this wisdom and this calmness, and he always points us to who Jesus is. And when we're in meetings and whatnot, he just kind of, so I always kind of live in that lovely little tension of who Pastor Roger is. So delightful is a different word for Pastor Roger. Okay, so if you've ever taken a class with me, you know, one, I get sidetracked really easily and go on tangents and just kind of go in different places, so I try to stay focused. We're going to try and keep this between 11 and 12. Again, a combination of teaching as well as time of conversation. And whenever I do any kinds of classes like these, I first ask a question. When we look at Scripture, or when we look at the world, who is the only being that actually knows the real purpose and meaning behind any of this? God. Are any of you God? Okay, so we start with that, because that means all we have are our hunches, right? All we have are our assumptions. They are faithful hunches, they are faithful assumptions, but they are not the truth, because only God knows the truth. And so whenever I do a class, whenever I do these kinds of conversations, I always say our purpose is with each other and with God to seek to understand, not to defend. To seek to understand, not to defend. And so when we're in dialogue, I want you to kind of put that in your forefront. First, I'm going to seek to understand what God is doing. I'm going to seek to understand what my brother and sister in Christ is saying. And I'm not going to try to defend what I think. Because in reality, if we're all doing that, we're not going to need to defend. Because we're each trying to seeking to understand what each other is about. So is that kind of an agreement we can come to for these times? right? And we're going to share our opinions, we're going to share our hunches, we're going to share our thoughts, but our first and foremost is we want to seek to understand one another. Okay, Luke, roll it.
I am here.
Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
Lord, why do you not hear the cries of their children in the bondage of Egypt?
I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Therefore I will send thee, Moses, unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring my people out of Egypt.
Who am I, Lord, that you should send me? How can I lead this people out of bondage? What words can I speak that they will heed?
I will teach thee what thou wilt say.
Okay, for how many of you that was kind of your beginning into the Ten Commandments? Right? Like Charlton Heston, say what you will, he will always be my Moses. Right? Like that's every Easter we sat down, Cecil B. DeMille, right? And the whole, and oh gosh, who was the brother? Not Ben-Hur. Oh, the guy who also played in The King and I. Yul Brynner. Oh, right? Oh, and when it's Ramses, and go back and watch, I'm telling you. So for so many of us, right, that is kind of that introduction. We know Moses and the burning bush. But to really kind of understand the Ten Commandments and kind of where it comes from, it actually started way before Moses, this whole story. It actually started with, show my first picture. Remember that guy? Donny Osmond. And what show is Donny Osmond in that one? Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Here's another one. Oh, right? I mean, you go from Charlton Heston to Donny Osmond. Like this is my world. These are the I had the actual Donny and Osmond dolls, like the 6-inch, because gotta love me some Donny Osmond. But actually, it's way back in Joseph that this story begins, that we have to kind of understand the context. Because in the story, right, where Joseph, when he ends up in this position, well, that position, he's already in Egypt, right? And why is he in Egypt? Because he'd been sold into slavery, right? And at this point in time, the famine had come. And what happens during that famine? Who comes to join Joseph? His brothers and his dad, right? And that's Jacob and his 12 sons, which we then know as the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And so that's what brought all of Israel into Egypt. And then when that happened, 500 years almost goes on. And can we have that first Exodus passage there, Luke? So in Exodus 1, we then read, then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So that the Egyptian came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians came ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service and mortar and brick and every kind of field of labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. So where once they were free, and there was kind of like how sometimes, like in New York City, you have like a little China, or we talk about in Miami, there's like a little Havana, right, where they lived in those little pods, and it was fine. But as they multiplied, right, what happens is the reigning people get scared. Instead of incorporating belonging, instead of coming together, they then go into fear and oppression. So about 500 years, generation upon generation upon generation, they no longer have freedom. Right? And so now they are these slaves. And so think about that for a second. What would that feel like to be a slave? What would you lose? What would you gain? What would slavery do to you? You lose your dignity? Take away your choices? Self-worth? Lose hope? Identity. Fear. Yeah. And what is it when someone is kidnapped and then they start to find love for their kidnapper? Stockholm syndrome. Right? So if you do this generation by generation by generation, right, you also become into an acceptance, into this is what we know. This, right? Also, slavery means you don't have choices, and so you know what it's going to be like when you get up in the morning. You know what your options are going to be during the day, right? Very regimented, very controlled in what that looks like, right? And so if that's just your day-to-day, you think of kids and parents, right? Kids, when they wake up, like in some ways, they're like, all right, parents are my masters, right? They used that language back then, right? The parents were the masters. You as the kid, you know what you were expecting. You know what that looked like. So throughout that, though, the Israelites still would call out to God, right? They still would say, free us. So finally, we know the story of Moses, right, where he is, again, in all of that slavery and oppression. Pharaoh's like, all right, they are getting way too populated. Let's kill all the boy kids, right, because that's going to be really, really helpful. So that happens. Moses, the baby, goes in the basket, goes down the river. He gets raised up into Pharaoh's house. And then at some point in time, he kills an Egyptian because he sees the violence that's happening. He gets kicked off. He goes out to Midian, right? And while he's there, that's when he encounters the burning bush. And when that happens, let's see this next Exodus piece. So this is God. Then God said, come no closer, remove sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. God said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Hold it right there. Go back for a second. I want you to notice, God said, I'm going to bring him out of the land of slavery, of Egypt, but I'm going to put him in a land that's already owned by a whole lot of people. Just hold on to that. Okay, keep going. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have given heed to you and to do what has been done to you in Egypt. I declare I will bring you out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to your voice, Moses, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us now go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Just a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice. That's all God's saying. I always found it really amazing when I first read that. Because it's like, wait, you're just freeing them from slavery to worship? Right? It wasn't, I'm going to free them so they are no longer in bondage, so now that they can have houses and now they can. No. Pharaoh would not let them worship God. And so God says, okay, go, tell Pharaoh, I want 3 days so you can come and make sacrifice and worship. Doesn't say forever, just 3 days. Did any of you ever know that before? Right? When we hear the story, we're like, oh yeah, God's going to free them from slavery. It's going to be amazing. They're going to leave. But this is what happens. So keep going in Exodus. So now we go to 5. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. Again, folks, the only reason was to worship. Right? Was God saying, we need to be in relationship. Pharaoh is not letting you be in relationship with me. So free them to have this time. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Boom! Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, but he will fall upon us with pestilence or sword, or he will fall upon us. But the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labors. Pharaoh continued, now they are more numerous than the people of the land, and yet you want them to stop working. That same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, as well as their supervisors, you shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather the straw themselves. But you shall require of them the same quantity of bricks as they've made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy. And that is why they cry, let us go and offer sacrifice to our God. Let heavier work be laid on them than their labor at it, and pay no attention to deceptive words. In corporate America, how often have we heard Pharaoh's words? You don't need a break. Work harder. Work longer. You're lazy if you don't produce. Right? The Sabbath. Think about all the things that are open on the Sabbath nowadays. Like the biggest thing for me was Black Friday. As I saw earlier and earlier stores opening, and how those workers weren't allowed to rest. Right? So when we talk about, are these 10 commandments still relevant today, that right there shows you how the world hasn't really changed. Right? That there's always a voice that is pushing us, saying, you don't need to worship. You don't need to be in relationship. There's other stuff you got to do. There's other things you got to produce. And so that right there is a fascinating way to enter into this space of thinking of this whole story is really a contemporary story in our own places. So then we know what happens, right? We know there's the 10 plagues. Just FYI, the word plague can also be translated as signs. So the 10 signs of God, which seems really radically different than plagues of God, right? What that context is. So then finally, Pharaoh says, yes, you can go after the Passover, after the firstborn is killed. They go, Charlton Heston, bam, right? Separates the Red Sea, and everyone walks through, and then there's a destruction. And so then they go to Mount Sinai, right? And so then we read these words. Now we're on Exodus 19. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim into the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. So Moses came summoned the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. The people all answered as one, "Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. This is the first time God gave people a choice. When God came to Abraham and said, "You're going to be the fathers of nations," did he say, "Do you want to?" Right? When he looked at Sarah and said, "Hey, you're going to have a kid when you're super, super old," how do you feel about that? You want to do that? Mary? Did Mary get a choice? Right? The angel just appeared. "Hi, 13-year-old girl. Guess what? I've got a deal for you." Right? Joseph didn't get a choice in that either. This is the one time that God says, if you want to be my people, I'm going to establish some boundaries for us. I'm going to talk about how we are in community together with one another. Are you in? And the people say yes. And so that's one of the reasons why this covenant, this relationship, this contract is incredibly special. Because it's the only time, I mean, not even Noah. Noah didn't even get a choice, right? Like again, well, maybe Connie's getting a choice. But no one ever gets a choice. But in this one time, they say yes. Now we know what happens is Moses goes up and he hangs up on the mountain for a long time. And then what happens down below in the mountain? Right? It's their first taste of freedom in 500 years. I mean, think about that, right? Like you talked about the choices, right? The regimented life, like what that looks like. It was a college dorm, right? When that first hint of, freedom, right? I remember when I was walking, my freshman year when I was in school, I may have been walking back to my dorm at maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. But I went to school in Kentucky where there was no cars and it was a dry campus, so we just went to the local elementary and played on the playground till 5 o'clock in the morning. So, I mean, really, that was a good time. But as I was walking back, I thought, oh, I need to tell my mom I'm home. And then I took another step and I was like, oh, she doesn't know I'm out. And then my next step was, so she's not going to wake me up in the morning either. Right? And I still have this crystallized moment of this taste of freedom and responsibility. Right? And so you think about the Israelites, again, they had never ruled themselves. They had never governed themselves. They had never set up what it means to be a house, what it means to be a community, what that looks like. And so again, these boundaries, God says, oh, sweetheart, little children, you don't know how to do this. I do. So let me help you kind of figure this out. Now, they go to Aaron, and they ask Aaron to make what for them? The golden calf. Now, here's something new that I learned that I thought was fascinating. So, and Aaron actually says, after he makes the golden calf, he said, here is the God who brought you out of the wilderness, right? He names that golden calf. Now, for my understanding and watching Cecil B. DeMille, right, I always thought it was like a foreign god, it's Baal, they're now going to worship this. Well, so actually, and Connie's shaking her head because she read the same book I did, I learned that the Egyptian tradition, which again, remember they had been Egyptian for 500 years, is they would make what they called house gods. And so they would make statues of their gods that they would have in their houses. So that they would be able to have the gods come with them. Right? Now in that first commandment, we talk about God says there's no graven images. So when they make this calf, what they are making is an image of God to lead them. I was like, oh, that's really different. Didn't realize that. But what God does and says, no, you don't need to make these images anymore because I'm going with you. right? It's that pillar of fire by night, the pillar of cloud by day. God says, you don't need to make a container for me because I will be with you. And that's Jesus, right? God makes that same promise when the Word becomes flesh. That God says, as Jesus, I now am with you in relationship and what that looks like. So in hearing some of those things, let's pause for a second. What's coming to your mind? What's different? What's new? What are your thoughts in that space about those 10 Commandments and that history and context? Anything? This is where I also take a drink of water, just so you know. Yeah.
Just the thing, knowing that we think that they would have known what to do, but really, if you think about it, they've been slaves. They had never made any mistakes. So God really needed to.
Yeah, we think like, well, yeah, why would they would know what to do, but really when you put it in that context, it was complete anarchy because that's all they knew. And so again, the word commandment also can be translated as blessings, right? So these are the 10 blessings from God. Not just thou shalt, but these are blessings of how we're in relationship with one another. Other thoughts on the 10 Commandments and so far in this concept? Yes, Dan?
Well, the idea that they created this calf was already the impression that they turned away from God. But they hadn't really. That was how they were to represent Him.
And think about how often do we wear our cross necklaces, right? Or how we have pictures in our houses of worship, right? That we do that same thing. One of the gentlemen who went on the Holy Land, I should have brought it in, went on the Holy Land journey. You are allowed to take rocks. Allowed. It means like if you don't have like big boulders and like not over like 25 pounds, you probably can bring it back with you through customs. And so what this gentleman did is he picked up rocks at all the different places we were at, put them in a little baggie, labeled the little baggie, and he now has this really great Tupperware deal, and he has all of the rocks labeled from Capernaum and Galilee and Mount Nebo and all this whole entire deal, right? So in that way, he has built that altar, built that shrine to bring with him, to take what was there and bring here, right? And so again, very human to be able to do that. We have to remember that God says you don't need it, right? And the beautiful thing is like in the depths of your pain, you don't need anything because I'm already there, right? These same Israelites hundreds of years later would suffer in the Holocaust and in the prison camps. Right? And for them, they didn't need the graven images because they knew their God was right there with them and would eventually, again, redeem them in that space. And so if you think about, sometimes we talk about that the Old Testament has all this death and destruction and whatnot. If you are someone who is sitting in a prison camp, you can say, well, my ancestors suffered for 500 years and God never left them. And so this Exodus journey is a story of hope, and it's a story of promise. And so I will believe that as well. And so that's how we can begin to see, and this choosing that God says, I have chosen you, is that grace. Right? Again, this is, people say, oh, the Old Testament God, old, angry, there's no grace. This is God's testament of grace. Saying, I will choose you. And I will give you these boundaries. And so when Jesus then comes to say, I am here to fulfill the law, that again is God's grace. And when Jesus boils down the commandments to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. On this hangs the law and the prophets, right, of what those 10 commandments are. Now, Pastor Tim, he talked about that there's 2 different ways of numbering the 10 Commandments. Actually, there's 3 different ways that are known. Luke, can you show me a slide? Forget the Deuteronomy, I'll do that later. That one. So FYI, the Jews have a way of numbering them as well, because it did come from them. So we can't just claim all just Christian. So there's the Jewish way, the Catholic and Lutheran way, and then the Protestant way, also evangelicals. Again, the main difference is that we have combined that graven images is really, so if you look at the Jewish, it's the identity piece. I am the Lord your God who has taken you out of the land of Egypt. That's their first commandment. It's reminding them of who God is, right? That's their hope. That's their promise. And the Protestant, they really go into that graven images piece. So they set that aside, right? Again, and that kind of leads into that whole concept of God going with us, what that looks like. In the Lutheran and Catholic, we go more into the coveting. Our big difference is 9 and 10 at the bottom there. We really separate those out. Which I think also speaks to our understanding of how much we are never satisfied with what we have, and our human desire to always want what isn't ours. And so we really focus and divide that into 2 different ones. A couple other fun tidbits. Deuteronomy, right? So Deuteronomy, we said there's 2 different times that the commandments are given. Exodus and then Deuteronomy. Does anyone, the word Deuteronomy, do you know what it means? The second giving of the law. And so Deuteronomy, Exodus is where they do a lot of the giving, but they're kind of also at Sinai, they're kind of in that place. Deuteronomy is now they've kind of established their wandering in the desert, and so it's the second giving. And so often in Deuteronomy, that's where the Lutherans go. That's where it's actually separated out into those 2 different ones. So we live with the Deuteronomy part. And then also, talking about Martin Luther, he, when he does the 10 Commandments and he does a small catechism, what he does is he takes not only what you're not supposed to do, but then he also says what you are supposed to do. And so as we go through our worship services, we're actually going to utilize Luther's small catechism as part of our worship service as how we are to protect and care for our neighbors, not just not hurt our neighbors. And so Luther kind of takes that twist to add that positive piece in. Prophets, embodiment, forgiveness, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so we're about halfway through. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to turn to some people, or maybe if, and I'm just going to pick on you guys because you're married, you know each other, maybe get to know some other people. But even if you came with people you know, maybe get to know some other people. But I want you to do, I'm going to give you 3 to 5 minutes, depends on how long I get bored, to have some conversation. And talk about, first we're just going to talk about laws and commandments. Why are laws good? Why are laws, and why is breaking laws not a good thing? But also, when is it time to break a law? Let's get a little spicy. So why are laws good? Why is it good to uphold the law? But when is it okay and good to break a law? All right, get to know someone. I'll give you 3 to 5 minutes. Bring it back. And for those of you online, hopefully you talk to whatever pet, person, or plant is within your space. So let's just have a little reflection of some of that conversation. Why are laws good? What is good about a law? Why is it good to keep them? Structure. What do you mean by that, Bob?
Gives you a space in which to operate, for instance.
Gives you a space in which to operate, for instance. I'm going to repeat things, one, just so that people can hear them, and especially our online people, not because I feel like I need to reiterate the brilliant words that you all are saying. So just so you know. Excellent. So it gives you a space to operate in. What else are law good? Anne?
Well, in a group, it helps people know how they're supposed to behave or what they're supposed to do. Like if you're driving, you have rules for driving.
Yeah, so in a group, it helps you know how to behave. It helps you know what the expectations are. Jane, you were saying that you guys kind of said some of the similar things.
It kind of prevents anarchy. If you have no laws, you're gonna, overall, it's just gonna go crazy.
So laws are intended to prevent the anarchy, right? To prevent the chaos from happening. That's the intention of the laws, right?
That's what I was saying, chaotic.
Yeah.
The world would be totally chaotic.
Yeah, our world isn't chaotic at all, right? With all of our laws. I mean, gosh, yeah, it's so orderly with all of our laws. But that is the intention, right? That it is to provide the structure, right? To give the expectations. We call those norms in sociological language. That's the norms of your society, what that looks like. Other reasons why laws are good. Protects us from stupid people. And remind me your name? Gail, you're going to be one of my favorites. Yes. So protects us from stupid people, right? That again, that's the hope of the law, is that again, it's a protection space. Excellent. Yeah.
By doing away with the chaos, it actually gives you more freedom.
Jim, right? So Jim said by doing away with the chaos, it actually gives you more freedom. Right? Like I feel very comfortable and free when I know what my parameters and boundaries are. So I'm one of those people, I like my expectations, I like to know what my boundaries are, and they don't oppress me, they don't feel heavy for me. It makes me actually feel more free, because I know what to push against, I know what the expectation is, right? Other people, they feel the opposite, right? If you say color in the lines, they're gonna go, what lines? Right? Sometimes our youth director, Josh Carlson, I feel operates in that way, right? I'll say, okay, here's what I want you to do, and then all of a sudden it's like, wah! But oftentimes what he does is so much better than what I imagined in my structure, right? So sometimes the breaking of the laws, right? So let's move into that conversation. Is it ever okay to break laws? Yeah.
During civil rights time,
Yes.
it was morally right to break the laws, legally wrong.
Yeah, so Don said during civil rights times, it was morally right to break the laws, but legally wrong. And it depended on whose morals. Right? I mean, so that's where that judgment piece comes in, that opinion piece, that hunch piece, right? Because some people were really comfortable with those laws, according to their morals. So when you have a moral objection, right? What else is it okay to break laws, or what are examples of laws that have been broken?
Well, we're kind of deemed unfair.
When they're deemed unfair, Stan says. Yeah.
I think it definitely would be deemed unfair to break when you're trying to make a change. And if we don't do that, then that change will never come.
Yeah, so Jane says breaking laws is also an agent of change, right? That you're trying to make those changes to kind of move things forward. And sometimes you have to break a few eggs to get a good omelet, right? That you have to break those to be able to move forward. Laura, what were you going to say?
Well, kind of what she said, like the suffragettes.
Yeah,
They broke a lot of laws.
the suffragettes.
People now, when you get offering sanctuary to people, to leave people come in illegally, way breaking the law, but people have a moral obligation to help people.
Yeah. And that's where it really becomes tough, right? Like if we, one of the words that Luther uses when he talks about the 8th commandment about bearing false witness, he says that we are to look at everything our neighbor does in the best possible light. And so I've tried to really adopt that. People say sometimes, oh, you're just too optimistic. Like, well, I'm going to give people a benefit of a doubt. I'm going to look best possible light and see like, is there a way that this was actually intended as a good thing? And so I think if we look at our laws in general, best possible light, at the time and context they were created for fair and justness, right? In the time and the context, right? Okay. See, I'm like, best possible light, I will give people the benefit of the doubt that in the context, right, and when people are trapped by their time because they know no difference, right, it's easy to look back, hindsight 2020, easy to look back and say, oh, they're ridiculous, right? But the problem then becomes is time changes, context change, people change. And so then how do we begin to insert our own understandings and values and what that looks like when it comes to these laws? And so to put this in context so that people are like, Pastor Aaron's getting political. Okay, well, FYI, the church is very political. Jesus is very political, but we'll have the conversation later. To put this in context of the 10 Commandments, right? Again, the context and the time when this was written, a couple thousand years ago, they were trapped by their context and time. They were trapped by their understanding of what that was. They could not envision something future because there was nothing that they knew different. And so we have to take that into consideration when we look at what this means for today's world. Right? Again, the easiest ones are to think about whenever it talks about your spouse as property, when it talks about slaves, right, that we're to, that kind of language, that is not language we use now. And so how do we still maintain the integrity, the intention of these commandments, of these laws, but interpret it into our modern context? Brian, you asked the question, like, why are the difference in the numbers? Why didn't they all just go to the same one? Like, Charlton Heston, he had to figure it out. Why didn't they all just live in his world, right? Like why not? And so part of it is how do we have our modern context still be faithful to God's intention of the word, right? And if you were in my Bible 101 class, right, that was our constant struggle of how in our day-to-day lives today do we still live with intention of what God is doing. Now, if I were to change the word law to boundary, how does that change your thought? I heard it, what does that do in your world? If you change the word law to boundary, where does your brain shift?
You can go beyond, closer to the limit.
Oh, nice. Boundaries, closer to the limit. Excellent. Push it. Push it real hard. Okay, yes. So you can push a boundary a little bit differently than break a law. And you change boundaries. Do boundaries feel a little bit more easy to manipulate, softer, flexible? Yeah. And so these commandments are also boundaries for relationship. If you draw a boundary with someone in a relationship, does that mean you don't care about the person? Right? And sometimes you even put boundaries in place so you can care for each other better. Right? And so when we think about the relational nature of what these commandments are, that's where we go into these boundary places. That God has created these boundaries for us to be in relationship with one another so that we have the expectation. When I was went to go work at a gym, this is when I was in Minnesota, and I hate getting lockers. I never have the locks, the whole deal. So I just grabbed my car keys and I kept my purse in my car and I went in and I worked out in the gym. Right? Thou shalt not steal. Should be safe. Should be an expectation I should be able to hold. Right? We created this boundary. People should not do things. So what happens? I go out to my car and my window's smashed in and my purse is gone, right? And I was like, oh, crap, I think everything, right? But also all of my business cards from being in a church were in there. Like I tell you, never had identity theft. None of my credit cards were used. I don't know if that was oh crap, Jesus is going to strike us down. Like, I don't know if that was part of it. But so I walked back into the gym and I said, my car is smashed and my purse has been stolen. What do you think people said? Right? Right? Total blame the victim. Right? It was my fault that I left my property locked in my car. It's my fault. I was like, what about the idiot who stole? Like, why aren't we blaming him? Or her. I mean, I don't know. Well, I had it covered. They didn't know. Well, actually, what I did learn was that people sit in parking lots. And they notice if you go in just with your key, then they go over to your car. Yeah, no, don't do that. I did that. Trunks aren't bad though, because if they can't see in the trunk, that's a different thing. Anyways, but that concept of, right, there was supposed to be a boundary. We had said do not steal. It is illegal. It is a law. But who gets blamed? Because it's almost acceptable nowadays. Right? Like it's acceptable. We say, okay, well, duh. Right? Right? To lock my property in my property. Right, yeah, laws are supposed to protect us from stupid people. Sorry, it didn't work too well. All right, so, but when we think about like how we understand what laws are, we don't even uphold them. And now our society has moved into a place, well, you get what you get, and you didn't even break the law, but you were stupid. And therefore, you were subject to someone else breaking the law. And so again, when we think about these boundaries, I want us to think about these commandments, these boundaries, of way of God saying, if you want to be in relationship with me, and if you want to be in relationship with each other, this is how I'm going to ask you to behave. Now, are those questions relevant to today? Right? I mean, those are things that we have within our own families. Right? And if we're a family of God, we have that. Now, has anyone ever broken your boundaries or pushed your boundaries a little bit too far? Right? And so in that, there's the grace and forgiveness. Luke, let's go ahead and put up the Deuteronomy text, because this is what I love about God. God, you're so great. So Deuteronomy, again, the second giving of the law. So probably the Israelites, well, but what if we bend these? Like, do we really need to follow these? See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death, and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and the length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Right, so that's what God says. And following these commandments, these blessings, and living within these boundaries, you experience life and abundance. But when we are led astray, when we turn against, then we are persecuted as the one who was stupid and kept her purse in the deal. Right? But we get death. We get adversity. I said it right the first time. Adversity, thank you. I was like, oh, I read it right, and then I totally messed it up. I also want us to think about life and death doesn't just mean bodily. Right? Like one of the things, I think it's Pastor Roger who's doing Do Not Kill. But when I would teach this with confirmation kids, I was like, I bet you all like, woohoo, do not kill. I mean, I've done one commandment, I've kept one commandment, right? But how many of your words have killed someone's soul? right? Like there are many different types of deaths that we can die. And so when God is saying death, it may not just be like the lightning strikes that happen oftentimes in the Old Testament, it feels like, but it may not just be those, but we also suffer that death inside ourselves, that darkness, right? When we don't have hope, I think that lack of hope is another space of death. And so in keeping these boundaries, God is saying you will experience abundant life and what that looks like. And I think through Jesus, we see that even more. That Jesus is the one who does these commandments, who lives this way. Obviously, he is God, so it's pretty easy to have no other gods because it's himself, right? But being able to have Sabbath, being able to recognize the power and attach to God what is God's through God's name, to keep it holy, right? To honor our elders, our mothers and fathers, right? To not kill in spirit and soul and mind. You know, Jesus was the one who did not bear false witness, right? He was faithful in his relationships. In all relationships, he was faithful. He didn't steal. And then he also was very satisfied with who God had created him to be. He didn't covet the power of this world, right? When you think about the temptations of Jesus in the desert, right, that was one of those, was you could be the most powerful. He didn't want that. He didn't desire that. He didn't try to get that through ill means. And so Jesus lived the embodiment of these commandments and had abundant life. And so that's the promise that we are giving when we live faithfully. We're also promised the forgiveness when we screw up. You know, how many of you guys used 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, as part of a wedding or a vow renewal or anything else like that? I don't ever do those at weddings. I refuse. You're just setting yourself up for failure. I mean, because the whole thing is, the love that is being talked about there is God's love. It's not human love. And so when you're reciting to your partner, love is patient, love is kind, right? You're just setting each other up for failure. Like, God knows there ain't no way that you're going to be able to do that, right? And so in this, even in these commandments, and Pastor Tim talked about on Sunday, 600 and how many laws? 13, right? God knew in all of those you're going to fail epically. But because I chose you first, you're still part of that promise, right? When you have people who you love in your life and when they mess up, you're upset, you hold them accountable, you're hurt, but you still love. And sometimes you have to love at a distance, and we'll talk about boundaries like that. Sometimes you have to love at a distance, right? But they're still part of your world, and God says that to us as well. Okay, just a quick poll. Commandment that is the hardest for you to live under. What do you suffer with the most? What do you struggle with the most? The first one, thou shalt have no other gods? Oh, Luke's so good. He's like, I'll help you out. I'll put him back up there for you. So having other gods? Yes, in the back. Number two. The Lord's name in vain?
I'm terrible.
Oh, because you say, oh my God, a lot?
Oh, and then the sun.
Did any of you, what service was it where Pastor Tim almost said for, was it 9:15? 7:45. Well, he went Pete. When he sat down, he looked at me and said, I have never used those words in my life. He's like, I don't even know where that came in. I was like, oh, that was the Holy Spirit convicting you, my friend. Like that was just the Holy Spirit saying you are going to be an example that you mess up just as much as anyone else. So a lot of people talking about that one. Yeah.
I blame the Lutheran Church because I went to Lutheran parochial school and we spent recess working on every bad word.
It's true. It's true. Church people are the worst.
Yeah.
What other commandments do you struggle with? Yeah.
Thou shalt not kill.
Thou shalt not kill.
You brought it up earlier, and that's something.
Okay.
But just in the whole context of when you talk about self-defense.
Yeah.
You talk about like defending your
ethics of that.
The ethics of that,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, good. So just in a philosophical way, you suffer with that, right? Because I mean, Kathy, if there's problems, we can always help you. Okay. We have support groups. What else? What else do you guys struggle with in these top 10? Luke or Anne? Number 10. The coveting anything that belongs to your neighbor, or coveting your neighbor's goods. Now, Pastor Wyatt is going to be preaching on 9 and 10 together. And so I'll set him up for wherever he's at. When I teach these in confirmation, right, because it's kind of weird, like, what does it mean to covet your neighbor's wife, right? How does that relate to today? And then the difference with your neighbor's goods. So back then, wife also then created land and property, and all of that would be passed on for generation to generation, generation. So I tend to think of that one as those inborn traits that are given to you. So when Tanya sings, I desire that because I am not a singer, right? Like there's certain things that are inborn traits of people. They're just naturally gifted. Some people may covet my ability to wear cute shoes. I mean, others don't, but, right? So those are, oh, thank you. Tanya shoemakers, very nice. But so those inborn traits, when we covet what other people have that God has given them. And then the 10th one is the stuff, right? That's the nicer house, it's the nicer cell phone, it's the nicer car. And so when I look at the difference of those, there's the internal and there's the external. And what that looks like. So that wanting other people's stuff and always wanting kind of what you don't have sometimes. Yeah, more, right? And the opposite of that is being satisfied with what you do have and being grateful. What? It is the American way. Very much so, our culture. And other cultures, sadly, are catching up to that. But our culture does kind of, and in some ways, it's a fantastic part because we're never satisfied. We always want to go to the next. But in some ways, it's not very helpful. Other commandments that y'all, yes. Remember the Sabbath day.
I mean, you can shop for groceries, you can go to movies, you can do whatever you want to do on Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah.
It used to be that way when we were little kids.
Yes, yeah. So remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, especially when there's all these options. I think Pastor Tim is going to be preaching on that one. I came up with the title, and it's very catchy, just so you know. It says, Rest is for the Weak, W-E-E-K. Right? Like, I'm really kind of proud of that one. But also, part of our culture is if you rest, then you're weak. Right? We don't rest. We thrive. Oh, how many times do we brag on how many hours we have put in at the office? Right? And what that looks like. We're 24/7, 7 days a week, 365, the whole. And what does Sabbath really mean? Right? Does it just mean taking a nap? Right? Or what does rest with God really mean? So, yeah. Excellent. Well, I think, as we continue to go through these, we'll be experiencing and kind of living into what these different commandments are. Again, this is just kind of that intro. I wanted to set some of that context of what this looks like and remembering what laws and boundaries. Again, always when we're looking at Scripture, we look at what happened in the past. We look at the context of what that is and how that informed what was happening. And then we ask the question, what is God doing with that now? Right? Because the living word is the living word. It is still shaping us. But we understand it even deeper when we can reach back to see what God was doing so we can move forward in that space. Excellent. Awesome. All right. So we'll be here same time next week. And I think Pastor Wyatt will be teaching on the first commandment. So get all your questions ready. Excellent.